This is the finale in a 4-part series going over the common myths, lies, and misconceptions within the canon of Marxism-Leninism. In this part, we will be discussing the deportations. Before, during, and after World War II, upwards of 2 million indigenous and diaspora minorities were torn from their homes and resettled to other areas within the USSR. Population transfer varied in its reasons and justifications, and occurred in a series of waves, as opposed to just one single action. There are far too many factors involved in the category of deportation, so I will be simplifying to the most relevant for the sake of brevity. The first group to be transferred were the Koreans, in 1937 before the war had even begun. It's worth noting, however, that the authorities had the intentions of transferring the population as early as 1926. Following the annexations of the Baltic, Poland, and Bessarabia, that's Moldova, the USSR again began to move people around, this time mostly Polish and Romanians, Balts, and Estonians. After Barbarossa came the largest single group to be deported, the Volga Germans, with around 700,000 to 800,000 moved. The largest wave occurred during the recontrol of Crimea and the North Caucasus. This included Kalmyks, Karachays, Chechens, Ingush, Balkars, Crimean Tatars, as well as some Turkish and Kurdish minorities. The final wave came after the war, and this lasted until 1949. It largely included again the Baltic peoples and Estonians. The deportation process was swift and brought untold hardship upon those affected. Within the first 2 years after deportation, it is estimated on average that 10% of people lost their lives due to the deplorable conditions they were left in upon arrival, with some groups as high as 25%. The reasons given for deportation often varied. The Koreans and Germans were deported due to fears that they would act as fifth columns to the Japanese and Reich respectively, though it's debatable if this were much more than paranoia for the latter, considering their near 180-year disconnect with Germany. The Polish and Baltic purge was justified under the pretense of clearing out reactionary elements, though in the latter's case the overwhelming majority were women and children. But the predominant view for the largest deportations in 1944 were much more punitive. That this was a collective punishment for some elements actively collaborating with the Nazis. From my research on the Crimean Tatars, sources anywhere from around 20 to 50,000 people were Soviet-aligned, or fought separately in partisan groups, with only roughly 10 to 20,000 collaborating. Chechen Ingush made around 17,000 aligned, with roughly 5,000 or so collaborators or insurgents. The same is true for the Kalmyks, with an even higher Red Army participation. In nearly every one of these examples, the amount of people collaborating is less than those who served their country. One very strong propagator of the collaborationist line is our old friend, Grover Furr. In his book Khrushchev Lied, he makes some absolutely vacuous arguments in defense of Soviet measures during this time, which a lot of Marxist-Leninists appear to have gobbled up wholesale. Firstly, he estimates the amount of people who collaborated by comparing the Soviet allegations with the relative number of people in said ethnic groups. So, if there were 220,000 Tatars, then there should be 20,000 men of military age, meaning 20,000 collaborators would conveniently make up all of them. Importantly here, Furr assumes that such collaborators could only have been of this specific age group, and therefore concludes that it would have been genocide if it were only the men who were killed or deported. That's a very convenient conclusion. Why must all the collaborators be of military age? Could they not have been older people who had more sympathies with the Empire? Why could they have not been women? He concludes, therefore, that there were only 3 options that the Soviets could have taken. 1. Letting the deserters go scot-free. 2. Killing the deserters, meaning no more babies, apparently. Or 3. Deport everybody, meaning babies. Again, interesting conclusion. I can think of 3 more off the top of my head. 4. Re-education followed by reintegration. 5. Deport briefly whilst you sort out the flanks, then bring them back. Or 6. Grant further autonomy to these republics, seeing as they were not ideologically fascist. Or would that go against your longer-term goals? And finally, just to showcase Furr's level of intellectual honesty, he concludes that the deportations weren't that bad because only 0.25% of those transported died. That's a lot different than the 10 to 25% figure we got earlier. Furr is only referring to those who died during transport, not those who died within a few years upon arrival, being left to fend for themselves in the harsh conditions as a result of such actions. That's a very misleading and dishonest statement about what occurred, not befitting a so-called historian, which Furr is not. He's an apologist. If you are going to use Furr as a source in the future, please understand that I'm not going to take you seriously. So in the name of intellectual honesty, I must admit that figuring out the exact figures on who did and who didn't collaborate is not an easy task, and I'm sure that there's other statistics that I've overlooked. However, measuring collaboration as simply a treasonous offense misses an opportunity for some very edifying introspection. What might such high collaboration tell you about the existing hegemony? That such minorities viewed the invader, of whom we all know did not have the most immaculate of intentions, as a lesser evil when compared to the devil they knew. Historically, this region of the world has not been the best showcase for Russian exceptionalism. To just take one example from Crimea, when the Nazis started pushing on inwards, the NKVD's scorched earth tactics of summary executions and destroying vital utilities had the effect of harming the inhabitants much more than the invaders they hoped to deprive. From their immediate perspective, you can see from just this example alone why such disillusionment might be readily present among such people. But the real insight is understanding that the reality of collaboration contains much more fluidity than you can ascertain from data alone. Less a statement of ideological positioning, rather a tactic used to increase your chances of survival. There were minorities who infiltrated the fascists in order to gather intelligence, and there were fascists who did the same to minorities. One might be fighting on the Soviet side one day and on the Nazi side the next, playing off both sides to benefit their own standing. Collaboration is also muddied by the intent behind it, whether they genuinely wanted to fight for the Nazis or whether their so-called collaboration was rather simply enforced by the invaders. Whatever your thoughts are, numbers on a paper alone are not enough to place blanket assumptions upon these groups. So that covers the groundlessness of collaborationist excuses. However, a better question might be that even if such collaboration was so widely evident, why would it constitute such measures being taken anyway? During the American Revolution, numerous American Indian nations fought on the side of the British. Of note, these included members of the Cherokee and the Haudenosaunee. After all, the British had up until this point denied further encroachment into the westward frontier. So to them, given in that time and space, many chose to side with the British as lesser evils over the settlers. Does this collaboration justify untold crimes committed against the native inhabitants irregardless of nation? Does this justify moving them to faraway lands they've never heard of? No. These are white nationalist talking points. We've no trouble confronting attempts to justify and rationalize barbaric histories belonging to the so-called imperial core. Yet we often remain ignorant and place special privilege on states which have a certain place within the so-called socialist legacy. It really feels sometimes that people forget that what the USSR inherited was an empire which subsumed and incorporated various clans and fiefdoms to their will. There might be nuances between such conquest and the manifest destiny model, but it's nothing uncommon from a world power in the modern age. Those people groups are still there. Bad treatment of minorities doesn't suddenly change because those in charge are claiming to be socialists. The actions speak larger than words. Compared with other events, this one does tend to garner a degree of mourning from adherents. It's pretty difficult to defend, after all. But the language used when discussing it is highly telling. Such events are always treated as tragedies, mistakes, excesses. All effort is made to distance the legacy from wrongdoing. Prior positive claim is put on the Union beforehand, allowing you to then simply dismiss the faults because the ultimate goal or system is justified from your perspective. If you're trying to do a fair analysis, then it's those actions that ought influence your perspective on a system. We're talking millions of lives involved here. Please stop making such things into excusable mistakes. One of the deportations resulted in 700 men, women, and children being burned alive after being unable to transport due to bad weather. The word mistake is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Now, on the surface, Nazi collaboration is a very serious concern for the Soviet line, but dig a little deeper and you'll notice that such concerns appear a fair bit selective and unserious. If the Soviets were so afraid of Nazi collaboration, why was there no collective punishment placed upon ethnic Slavs? Wrongs were committed amongst all ethnicities who collaborated, yet let's not get our facts mixed up. Over 1.6 million Soviets collaborated. When it came to overall numbers, the vast majority of these were Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, who made up over 3/4 of the population at this time. Whilst there were punishments committed against individual Red Army fighters, collective punishments were only committed against minorities. Those dominant groups, meanwhile, took their former homes. Clearly, the USSR was not deporting those minorities on the basis of collaboration, but rather using it as an excuse for something else. Such mass mobilization would be an extreme reaction regardless of circumstances. So, what might be the reason then? Well, I have collected the most probable one, which points again to a clear social strata, the privileged Slavs. Whilst the NKVD were more easily able to infiltrate and weed out disloyal people from the more assimilated groups, trying to infiltrate the indigenous people proved much harder, as they were not as familiar with their cultural and tribal lines. In addition, there was a perception by the core that such groups had a systemic attitude of disloyalty to the hegemony and beliefs of the new Union. Sound familiar? Hearing reports of collaboration, then, the preferred option was to deport them, get as much space between them and us as possible in true Russian style, to protect the security of the Union. There's that line again. Need I state the obvious in case people aren't getting it? Fragility is their problem, not those they're deporting. They may well have never given a damn about an authority that has repressed them for so many years. Why could those minorities have not said the exact same thing for removing Russians? Has it not dawned on people that this is the exact same reactionary logic that we rightfully vilify at home? It should inform your perspective upon where the problem lies, not take the side of problematic actors based on the presumption of a force for good in the world. Let me make this clear. And this goes for any derisory accusation of anti-communism by dint of opposing a given state. You cannot claim to be the monopoly on progress, then influence and suppress at the barrel of a gun, and finally act surprised when people turn against you to whatever alternative is available. It's to nobody's surprise that there has been a systemic attack on socialist ideas by those who have an interest in capital, and over the past century much of that attack was directed almost squarely upon Marxist-Leninist states. One of the key motivators which brought me into the Leninist fold initially was learning that so much of what I knew about so-called actually existing socialism was based on half-truths and conjecture, driven by an opposing class interest. But as time went on, I had to ask myself, even if that were true, despite all the lies made, despite certain biased narratives spun, does that really mean it's still all worth it? If Molotov-Ribbentrop was not an ideological pact, if the Holodomor was not a genocide, if the Baltic Fleet had the wrong timing, or if minorities from minorities did side with the Nazis, does that still mean that the actions that the Soviets took are something you'd be fine with, that you consider in line with the socialist path, that you would justify, and not bother to ask further questions as to the nature of this ideology and legacy you're defending? For some of us, having gone over these questions, it becomes obvious that the answer to that is no, as being consistent would require some serious mental gymnastics to our moral worldview. But unfortunately, the answer for many, even those who have fully accepted these conclusions, is yes. An important reason for the growth and legitimacy of Marxism-Leninism today is largely due to the perceived lack of other alternatives being available. If you've realized that social democracy is foundationally incompetent at solving capitalism's contradictions, and you still feel that anarchism is an edgy juvenile pipe dream, what other option is there except the old man? Marxism-Leninism, whether you like it or not, has had a huge legacy. To many within our capitalist hellscape, that history provides a certain alternative, a place of refuge and comfort, a past that had a future. And so even with all the errors that were committed by such ideologues, it becomes difficult to throw it all away. The reasons for this legacy, and the arguments used to uphold it, are beyond the scope of this video. So I'm afraid you'll have to wait till next time. But until then, thanks for joining me on this series. It took years to write, months to edit, and we've still got more to come. See you shortly.